I would like to introduce our speaker for the evening. So, Dr. Randy Lair is the newly appointed Mary Griggs Burke Distinguished Professor of Environmental Science and Management and co-director of the Center for Freshwater Innovation at Northland College. So that's a mouthful. And what it means is he's been doing a lot of great science on Northland College campus, and now that Northland College is working with the Forest Service and just received a very large grant from the Mary Griggs Burke Foundation, the same woman who founded the museum, he is going to be helping start and do more research out at the Forest Lodge property, as well as programming and other things. So keep your eyes open for things to start happening out there. This summer they're already running summer camps, camping on the property, camping on the cow pasture, the porta potties, and as they get the buildings all fixed up, we'll be seeing even more out of that property, and Randy is going to be a big part of that. So let's give him a big welcome.
Well, thank you, Emily. I didn't even attempt to put the title on there. I didn't think there was any chance that it was going to fit on the screen in any way that you could read it at all. So I'm really excited to talk to you all tonight. I've seen actually many of you before. What I'm going to talk about is a lot of the lake research that we're doing in the area. We work with a lot of the different lake associations throughout northern Wisconsin and some of the different local governments to try to understand the health of lakes in our area and sort of what are the things we can do to protect them into the future. And so that takes on a bunch of different shapes. So over the last 5 years, I've been working with a group of students and some other faculty and staff at the college. Any given point in time, we have maybe 10 to 20 students that are doing different research projects related to lake health and stream health, and really focused in northern Wisconsin and Lake Superior. And that's all been part of what we call this Ecological Solutions Initiative. And now we've started this Center for Freshwater Innovation. So all this research that we're doing as it relates to lakes is going to be moving over and expanding in this new facility and this new program that we have. So tonight I'm going to talk kind of about the highlights of what we've learned over the last 5 years, and just point out that what we've been doing is really just this large collaborative. It involves a lot of the local governments, a lot of the local lake associations, the Forest Service, the Park Service, the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. A lot of people have been involved with this over the last 5 years. Okay, so that's who's doing the work. A lot of students involved. I wanted to, before we get into what we've done, add some context. Kind of give you a mental placeholder. By the time we get to the end of this will make a lot more sense. Has anybody heard of this before? The Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment? This is something that was in Minnesota. Yeah, so it was this large-scale initiative in 2008 to create a fairly sizable pot of funds to do natural resource management work. And this 2008, if you remember, was the kind of the height of the Great Recession. And in Minnesota, it was amazing how much support there was for a 25-year program that was going to increase sales tax, and that those sales tax proceeds were going to go to support water resource stewardship and natural resource restoration and the arts and parks and recreation. And so at the height of this Great Recession, there was a 56% vote of the overall voting population. 56% of the people supported this. And it led to this Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment that ends up creating somewhere between $240 and $300 million a year to do this natural resource work. And it was seen, really at the time, and still is, as kind of this landmark thing that happened. And the question I want to ask you, and the thing that we'll talk about at this is, we have to ask the question, who voted for it? Because raising taxes at this point in time was something that you would have not guessed that many people would have voted for. And so there's this, I'm not even sure what the way to describe it is. There's a general understanding in the social sciences and the psychological research areas that what happens, the way people make decisions is they have these different experiences, and these different experiences shape their values, and those values shape their actions. That's what causes people to act in ways that lead to the stewardship of water resources. And so what we've seen over the last 30, 40 years is that there are fewer and fewer people that participate in outdoor activities. And so there's a projection of the deer hunters in Wisconsin. You can imagine, the numbers of deer hunters, the percentage of the population in Wisconsin that hunt over time. The projections are that that's probably going to drop over time to some degree or another. People have written books about, the exposure of young children into the natural world and getting kids outside and involved in different things. And this paints a similar story, that there are just fewer and fewer people doing more and more things outdoors. And so this leads to this question: if this is true, if your experiences outdoors are what shape your values, and your values are what lead you to do things like vote for these constitutional amendments and other things, where is this happening? Are we losing the people that are going to be supporting this type of work, the stewardship of our lakes into the future? Is this something where our kids are in a spot where they're going to learn about and be able to appreciate these different resources that they have, so by the time they're adults, they'll be wanting to sustain these resources into the future? And so I'll come back to talk about this and maybe pose an answer to this question. But this is something that, if you work at the DNR, might even cause you lack of sleep of, who's going to pay for the DNR in the future? Who's going to want the DNR to be around? If there are fewer people doing outdoor activities, who sees the value of the DNR or these other agencies? And so, anyway, I'll come back to this kind of mental placeholder at this point. All right. So, the work we do is intended to be establishing these comprehensive assessments of lakes around the area. We try to do an assessment of what it is that people value about lakes, how they use lakes. The scientific world calls these beneficial uses. But when we look at lakes, what is it that's important to us? And then we try to connect that with the science that tells us a little bit about the ecosystem. What is it about the lake that makes it possible to use it in that way? So, for example, you might you ask people why they use lakes, and a lot of times swimming comes up. And you ask people, well, why do they like to swim in lakes? And it has a lot to do with the clarity of the water. How clean is the water? And then we can actually do quite a lot of scientific assessment to figure out what actually has to happen in the lake for us to have that nice clean water to swim with. And so if everybody wants to use the lake to swim, that's the beneficial use. And then we can structure all the science to understand, how do we keep it so people want to swim into the future? So before I go ahead here, I always like to put these different pictures up here. Does anybody recognize this picture over here? One of these beneficial uses? It's really close to here. Yeah, this is opening fishing on Lake Namakaga 2 years ago. So very strong dedication to this particular use. A lot of value for fishing in Lake Namakaga. This is just a caricature of, boy, all the different things that you can learn about the world. I've never actually seen that, but I'd be curious to know if it happens out in these natural ecosystems that we might look at. So one of the first places we start with this is we try to understand, why do people value lakes? What is important to them about lakes? What are the things that we should be thinking about as wanting to protect and sustain into the future? And the way we do a lot of that is we try to understand where on this continuum people's value sets typically end up. So on the one end, you could think about lakes as being valuable for purely internal purposes. You might think about this as the non-use side of the spectrum. Someone might look at a lake and say, wow, that is just a wonderful ecosystem unto itself. If I never get to use it, I never do anything in it, I'm just happy that that's there, that that's just a part of the world that we live in. And that would be the sort of the extreme end of this spectrum over here. Value just for the sake in and of itself. Some people use this term, an intrinsic value that's related to that. So we can start to move our way across this continuum, and you could say, well, this person may go out and experience a lake. They're going to obviously use the lake. They're recreating on it. But they're really not extracting much out of the lake. They're really not having much of an appreciable impact on the lake. You might go a little bit further and say, wow, there's a lot of people recreating on the lake. They're using the lake much more intensively than in other places. We get to some of these other scenarios here. This is one of my favorite questions. We have an audience member who can appreciate this, I think. I used to work in the Twin Cities for a group called the Three Rivers Park District, and we managed lakes in the area. And second week on the job, my boss at the time said, you should talk to this engineer that works in the city adjacent here about this lake. And I got my maps out and I'm looking for these different things, and I could not find the lake to save my life. I could not find the lake that he was talking about. I felt kind of embarrassed. I'm a water resource expert. I should probably at least be able to find a lake on a map to be able to have a conversation with somebody about, but I wasn't able to. I finally swallowed my pride and I called this engineer at the time. I was like, yeah, I was told that I should talk to you about this lake. And he's like, oh yeah, it's right there. We actually just dug that lake last year. Oh. It was a lake that had just been created as actually a stormwater pond, but it was a lake in the new management plan scenario, and they were going to build a bunch of houses on it to create essentially waterfront property in a development. And so, very different view on the value of the lake. It didn't even exist. They just created that lake, and that was something that was seen as really important, particularly for the property values in that area. So that's a pretty extractive use of water resources. You're actually creating. I mean, maybe it's not extractive; it's a creative use. Anyway, but it's different than over here. The last example I'll put up here is, I don't know if anybody recognizes this picture or not at all. This is like the extreme version of extractive use of water resources. It's a picture of the Aral Sea. And if people know this story or not, but in the Cold War era days, there was a lot of interest in the Soviet Union to be an island unto themselves, and one of the limiting factors to that was not enough cotton. And so to increase cotton production, what happened was the two main rivers that drained into the Aral Sea were dammed off, and the water was allowed to spread out or used for irrigation purposes to create cotton fields. And when you cut off the two main rivers that flow into the Aral Sea, it starts to dry up. And it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And if you've ever been cooking, you put a pot of water that you might have been boiling and you forgot about it, and the water were to boil away, what ends up happening is you get this little residue that's left. The water goes away, but the stuff that's dissolved in the water stays there. So as this Aral Sea over time got smaller and smaller and smaller, it got saltier and saltier, and so it wasn't really useful for irrigation. You really couldn't catch any fish out of it anymore. You really couldn't drink out of it anymore. And it became kind of this classic global example of how things can go awry in these large-scale ecosystems when we really just focus on the only value of water being sort of the extractive purposes, the removal of the water out of that system, in this case for irrigation. So we do a lot of survey research to try to understand, where are people on this continuum? When people look at our lakes, what are the things that are most important to them? Is it extraction of water? Maybe they have a farm, or maybe they're irrigating their lawn, or maybe they're really excited about boating recreation. So some of the research we do is trying to get at that question. So I'm hoping people can see this. I'm guessing people can't. So I'm going to walk you through what this is. So if you were to ask people, what are the most important ways in which you could use a lake? And this is Lake Owen. This is results from work we've been doing with the Lake Owen Association. What do you think is most important about the lake? And so we say, all right, is it enjoying the scenic beauty? Is it gathering with family and friends? Those are types of questions we would ask. So the more blue you would see, that means that everybody thinks that that's really important. If it's orange, that's somewhat important. If it's light blue, it's neutral. If it's tan, it's of little importance. And if it's gray, it's not important at all. And so I'll point out some trends here. We ask people these different questions. The things that float to the top that pretty much everybody uniformly agrees upon that is really important, the main things that are most important to them, are the way they interact with the lake. The beauty of the lake, a site for gathering with family and friends. The lake as a source of peace and relaxation, a spot where they can enjoy nature. As we start to get a little bit further down the list, it's generally some of those non-extractive uses. So going out and swimming, using non-motorized water sports, encouraging a sense of community amongst the users. At the very bottom of the list is typically where we get a little bit closer to more of the extractive uses. So removing fish or wild rice for purposes of food, hunting or trapping, irrigating or removing water out of the lake to water the lawn. So what we see is when we look across that continuum, and this is on Lake Owen, we've done these surveys now on maybe 10 or 15 different lakes, and the story's about the same. The things that people find most important on lakes in our area is the experience that they have on them. The experience that they have with people when they're on and around these water bodies are the things that they find most important, that they want to protect most into the future when we ask them in these different survey questions. So another thing we can look at is we can give them these different choices, and we can say, all right, if you were to be able to use the lake, and you would say, the property of my lake is primarily for a financial investment, or my property is primarily a place to live and recreate. We ask people to place themselves somewhere on that scale. So the closer the dot is to this side, the more they affiliate with these ideas. The closer the dot is to that side, the more they affiliate with those. And the same types of things come up. People feel like it's really important for them, for everybody, to take care of lakes. They feel like it's something that they ought to be a really big part of. They feel that it's important to conserve lakes, not necessarily for people's uses, but for the natural ecosystem processing. Certainly the human use of the lakes is something that's very important to people, but they also see it really important to protect those non-use values into the future. So I won't ask you to read all these things, and the test will be brief at the end of this, so you don't have to worry about too many questions at the end of things here. But what we find is that when I look at these surveys, people really love the lakes around here. They love the lakes because of the experiences they've had around there, and they're really committed to the protection and restoration and stewardship of these lakes into the future. And I'll talk more about that as we go along here. All right, so we can learn about what's most important to people in these lakes. And we do these surveys to try to quantify that. Then what we try to do is we do the science to go out and figure out what is it about the lake that makes it possible for people to use it in this way. So one of the ways we might think about this is that swimming example. The clearer the water, the less algae, the more interested people are typically in swimming that lake. So we can go out and do all sorts of detailed scientific analysis to understand why is the water so clean in this particular area. What do we need to do to make sure that the amount of algae doesn't increase in the water? And so what I'm showing you is a graph about a couple different elements of the Lake Owen ecosystem. How many people have been on Lake Owen? A few hands have gone up. Okay. Lake Owen, for those of you who don't know, is incredibly clear. It is one of, if not the clearest lakes in northern Wisconsin, including Lake Superior. There are times that you can drop one of these Secchi discs, these white and black discs, down 30 plus feet into the lake. That is phenomenal. I have been on lakes that you can lose your hand by putting it into the water. Being able to see down 30 feet is absolutely unbelievable. And so that's a really important part of the Lake Owen ecosystem that shapes people's experiences, it shapes the ecosystem as a whole. And so a lot of our research, as we were working with the Lake Owen Association, was trying to figure out why, in fact, is the lake so clear. And what we came to the conclusion was there were two main things that were happening. One is that Lake Owen is almost permanently stratified. So how many people have ever been in a lake where you swim on the surface, you dive down, and the water gets cold at a certain point? All right. Happens to a lot of people who have swam in lakes. What happens in most lakes is that over the course of the summer, the surface waters warm up, but the deep waters, they stay relatively cold. They call this stratification in the scientific world. And typically, once in the fall and once in the spring, that goes away. If you were to swim from the surface all the way down in the spring, it would be basically the same temperature from top to bottom, and the same thing would happen in the fall. Not in Lake Owen. Lake Owen doesn't turn over a whole lot. It doesn't fully mix. It keeps this warmer upper layer and cooler deeper layer more or less throughout the period of open water. This is a little bit unusual for lakes in our area, and one of the things that happens as a result of that is down at the bottom, these bright colors indicate the concentrations of phosphorus, one of the main nutrients in lakes. And what you can see is there's not a whole lot of nutrients in the surface waters, and there's a whole heck of a lot of nutrients down at the bottom of the lake. In fact, you can almost think of this as two separate lakes, the top half of the lake and the bottom half of the lake. Lake Owen is classified as one of these, I'll give you a science word, an oligotrophic lake, a low nutrient lake. It means the phosphorus concentrations are like 8 or 9 micrograms per liter for those of the chemists in the room here. At the bottom, this is like almost 400 micrograms per liter of phosphorus. This is the type of phosphorus concentration that you would expect in a heavily impacted lake by urban runoff or agricultural runoff. We have these nutrients at the bottom of Lake Owen, but they never get up to the top of Lake Owen. The fact that this lake is always stratified, the nutrients just sit at the bottom of the lake. And if all the nutrients sit at the bottom of the lake, there's nothing for algae to be able to grow. And so it stays really, really clear. And so Lake Owen is very unusual in that respect. It's almost two different worlds on the top and on the bottom. All right, another interesting thing about Lake Owen, so these are pictures of the dissolved oxygen. So as you go down, and as you go across the year, the brighter the red, the more oxygen. And so I'm not going to get into the details of all this, but what you notice in Lake Owen is that all of the oxygen is mostly in the middle of the lake. In most every other lake, this is Lake Namakogan, and most every other lake in our area is like that, most of the oxygen is at the top. And that makes sense, right? You know, the oxygen might diffuse out of the atmosphere, and so it gets into the surface water, so you have more oxygen at the top. Lake Owen is not like that. Lake Owen is totally different. Most of the life in Lake Owen is in the middle of the lake. And the reason we think that that happens is because of this. It's really clear, all the nutrients, all the food for the plants is at the bottom of the lake. So the algae grow as deep as they possibly can. And so instead of growing in the surface waters like they do in most lakes, they grow in the middle of the lake. They grow halfway down. Scientists call this the metalimnion of the lake. And so Lake Owen, because it has these unique physical processes, these unique biological processes, it's just really, really clear. And that's something that's really important to the people who live there. They talk about the overall clarity of the lake as being something that's really of significance, of value to them. So that's Lake Owen. How many people are familiar with the Namakogan chain lakes? All right, has anybody been on both Jackson and Garden Lakes at all? Very, very different lakes, right? So anybody who's seen them, or if you spent much time on them, turns out that Jackson Lake is quite a bit murkier than Garden Lake is. One of the reasons for that is that this is one of those pictures, this is the temperature. So the brighter the red, the hotter the water as you get further down in the water as the seasons progress. And what you see in Jackson Lake is it's pretty much the same temperature from top to bottom year-round. Most of these other lakes go through that stratification process. Garden Lake goes through that stratification process. What happens in Jackson Lake is that the wind is continually able to blow and mix up the sediments at the bottom of the lake, and so it's continually mixed. The nutrients, the water chemistry is the same from top to bottom, and what causes that to happen is the sediments are able to get mixed back up into the surface, and now there's enough nutrients for plants to be able to grow. So the water is a little bit browner, it's a little bit greener, and it's a very different story if you go into Garden Lake or if you go out into many of the other bays in the Namakagon chain of lakes. And so these unique physical characteristics are things that are important for us to take note of. This is important from a management perspective because if we were to ever go to Jackson Lake and say, oh, people love to swim, you know, we should do something to try to make the water clearer in Jackson Lake, we would probably not be able to do that. It would be very, very difficult to make the water in Jackson Lake as clear as it is in Garden Lake. In fact, they actually have different water quality classifications for these different lake types at the DNR. And so understanding sort of what the limits we have to work with is something that's a big part of understanding the lakes and how we interact with them over time. So Jackson and Garden Lakes, very interesting water bodies. Another thing that people talk a lot about that shapes their experiences in these lakes are shoreline ecosystems. It turns out that the health of the shoreline areas is a big part of the aesthetics that people find important about lakes. And it turns out that it's a really big part of the health of the fisheries that people oftentimes talk about as being particularly important. So as a part of our management planning process, we go out and we have our students drive around in boats and go to every mile of shoreline and identify the different characteristics of the shoreline and talk about the areas that are in really high quality, the areas where we have opportunities for restoration. And they do that so that we can start to understand and identify what are these critical areas around the lake that are really important to sustain the experience on Lake Owen or other lakes that we might work on, to sustain the fishery or the water quality. They also, in addition to looking at the shoreline, how well you can see in these bays here, they do surveys of the aquatic plants, and they do assessments of the diversity of plants and the numbers of plants that are found. Because it turns out that juvenile fish really like underwater plants. And so they go through and assess all these different areas and identify spots that are really, really important for the fishery. So one of the questions that we have then, if we ask about shoreline health, if there are different types of shorelines, some are managed in one way, some are managed in another way, but we know that shoreline health is really important in lakes. It's important for us to know, well, why do people manage shorelines in one particular way or another? And so we've been doing some other survey work with the Namakagon Lake Association to try to understand that a little bit. Why is it that people manage their shoreline and their property in different ways? And again, you can't really see this terribly well, but the one that comes out at the very top is that if you ask people why they manage their shoreline the way they do, they tell you that they're doing it to improve the health of the lake. As you go down the list, you see, trying to reduce shoreline erosion, or dealing with invasive plant species, or enhancing the aesthetics of their property, or the value of their property, or the view from their property, reducing flooding. But as we get to the top here, most of what they're doing is people really are intentionally trying to do something that they see as an improvement and a betterment, protection of the lake ecosystem. So people really work with the best intentions in most cases, not all cases, but in most cases. So we can understand why people manage shoreline in one particular area. Another thing that's really important for us to understand is, what is it that people value about their shoreline? So what is it in a perfect world that their shoreline would look like? And so we asked this, how important are these different factors influencing your property, the management of your property? We asked them all these different questions to see where they land. So a statement of saying, I prefer sandy beaches to all other lakeshore types around a particular lake. All the blue ones are agree, orange somewhat agree, on down that list. It turns out, and I was kind of surprised by this, that people who live around Lake Namakagon and other lakes, their favorite shoreline type is sort of a sandy beach. And that's an important thing for us to understand as to why people manage their properties in the way that they might manage their properties. People enjoy watching birds from their property. That comes up number 2 as to what's important about the shoreline on their properties. Having unobstructed views of the water. It turns out that when we ask, when we make the statement, water-based animals like frogs or turtles are bothersome, it turns out a lot of people don't like frogs and turtles on their property, which I was a little bit surprised by, but it turns out there were a lot of people that looked at that. Same being true for ants and mosquitoes, nuisance organisms. People don't particularly care for those. So we asked a bunch of different questions, trying to understand what is it that people value about their property? What are the drivers of their behavior? We asked this because we're trying to figure out what are the best ways to manage lakes that allow people to do all the things that they think are important, but also do them in such a way that we sustain these lakes into the future. Because people feel that they're really, really important to them and as a part of their community. So, all right, got another term for you here, an economics term, an externality. How many people have heard of an externality at all before? All right, that's just like a class. This is perfect. All right, an externality. Oftentimes people talk about these things as negative. So you might say that if I were to buy a hamburger and that came from a cow that was on a farm and there was some runoff that got into a particular lake, the price that I would pay for my hamburger would have nothing to do with any of the pollution reduction impact. So if there was runoff from a farm and it caused water quality problems and somebody needed to clean that up, the cleanup cost associated with me buying that hamburger, that wasn't in the price that I paid. That was sort of external to the transaction cost. Does that make sense with this idea of a negative externality? Is something that I have an action that I'm buying something, I'm doing something, but there's some other cost somewhere that I'm not associated with. Somebody else pays that cost. Most of the time people talk about these as negative things. They can also be positive things. And so the example that people talk about a lot of times is this idea of like herd immunity. As I get an immunization, somebody next to me gets an immunization, somebody else gets an immunization. What happens is you get to a certain point where everybody's holding an umbrella, so this guy doesn't really need an umbrella. The collective actions of everybody are creating these positive externalities. So not everybody needs to get immunized, but then everybody benefits from the fact that most people are immunized. Does that make sense? So we can have these positive spin-offs of different decisions. I make a decision and it makes everybody else around me that much better off. One of the things we think about with shorelands in particular is, are there things that we can think about that healthy lakes are an accidental byproduct of? One of the examples that jumps out to me is this. Most everybody enjoys watching birds from their property. Does that give us opportunities to work with people to promote bird diversity on their property, but to promote bird diversity on their property in a way where the side effect of that is there's less runoff going into a lake. We have better near-shore habitat for aquatic organisms that are there. If we can work with people to work on these things that are really, really important to them, having birds on their property, and then accidentally we end up with all of these other wonderful attributes of these lakes. We end up with clean water, we end up with great fisheries into the future. That's a very win-win situation. Having our cake and eating it too, I guess, is the title of this slide for a reason. So a lot of this survey work is trying to find those win-win situations. Can we try to figure out what is good for individuals and good for everybody at the same time and create those opportunities? All right. So I'm going to shift gears here a little bit and kind of talk about a couple other bigger questions, and then I'm going to come back to that question I asked you at the very beginning. So I'm going to make two statements here and see if people agree with me. This word, it gets used a lot. Sustainability. Good things being sustained into the future is more or less what we're talking about with that. And I'm going to make the statement that most human activities could probably be sustained into the future indefinitely if they were at a small enough scale. So in our area, we've heard a lot of talk about confined animal feeding operations lately, and these are just questions of scale oftentimes. That, if we had one pig in one particular area, that's obviously something that could be sustained into the future. If we have a lot of pigs in a particular area, is that something that can be sustained into the future? Perhaps it can in one area. If that was happening everywhere around the world, would that be sustainable? Maybe so, maybe not. A lot depends on the details. But if you get to a small enough scale, most activities we could sustain into the future without negative byproducts. The other thing that I'll say is that most negative environmental change can be corrected, can be remediated at a small enough scale. So when I was in grad school, I'll give you an example. So extra points here. Anybody know what these are? All right, these are C18 cartridges. They are used to remove chemicals out of water for identification. If I want to know how much of a pesticide is in the water, I run the water across one of these things and it extracts all the pesticide out, and I analyze it and I say, oh, that's how much DDT there was there. That's how much 2,4-D was in the water column. Turns out these things are really, really efficient. You can remove like 99% of a chemical in the water if you run it across one of these things. So you learn about this and you think, well, how is it possible that we ever have chemicals in the water ever? I mean, if we have these technologies that can remove them, why wouldn't we just route every wastewater facility through a great big one of these? Why wouldn't we route every industrial facility through a great big one of these and just take out all the chemicals out of the water? And the question gets to this idea of scale. In fact, I thought about that a lot when I was in grad school. Could we just make a big one of these things? And it turns out that it's just incredibly cost prohibitive to be able to do that. But if we wanted to do it at a small enough scale and we could spend enough money, we could remediate relatively large-scale contaminant problems. If we work at a really small scale and we want to put enough money into it, we can correct just about all of these problems. So, these two statements. We can sustain most activities into the future, and we can correct most activities. It just kind of depends a little bit on the scale. Does that make sense? Have you buying that argument? Yeah, so a few nodding their heads, and hardly any closed eyes, so that's a good thing. So, if you believe those things, one of the interesting things about that is a lot of our environmental conflicts may just be examples of that. This idea of scale. If my value set could be sustained into the future, and somebody else's value set could be sustained in the future, sometimes we're just arguing about whose values take precedent when we make decisions about things. Should we have a confined animal feeding operation? Someone would say yes, someone would say no. Really, we're just talking about whose value sets take precedent when we make that decision. Do we think we're going to have this facility or we're not going to have this facility? And those are very, very different things than we are typically studying in lakes. We haven't really been studying things like fairness and equity or the governance processes around lake systems or how are people represented in decision-making processes. But these are really big components of how we make these fairly complex environmental decisions. How people are represented in the process, whose values are represented in the process, ends up being a really big part of a lot of the conflicts that we see, specifically around water, but around lakes, around many of our natural resources and environmental problems. All right, I'll put this up here as an example of that. Many people have heard of this debate here recently, NR 115. Does that ring bells for people? Yes. NR 115 is the piece of state legislation that governs the management of shorelands around lakes. And up until recently, it has been written such that local governments were in a position to, this was basically the minimum. The state law was the minimum, and local governments could add things on top of that. So many of the counties, Bayfield County in particular, went through and did an exhaustive study of the lake. They came up with this classification system, and they said, okay, on these lakes, they're very environmentally sensitive, we're going to have one set of zoning laws. On these lakes, they're a little bit less environmentally sensitive, we're going to have another set of development laws. What is being proposed right now is that local addition is going to go away. In the process right now of joint finance, the Joint Finance Committee, there is the caveat that would basically say the only thing that can be applied to shoreline management in Wisconsin is this state minimum. And this ends up being one of these really complex problems that people talk a lot about. Why would you get rid of that? Why would you, make it? Why would you change around the legal structure associated with how we manage shoreland areas? And the rationale that's typically presented is that it's too confusing. If someone were, as a developer or someone wanted to manage their lands and it's different on this lake and the rules are different over there and the rules are different over there, it makes it very difficult for people to navigate through the process. And if we want to be fair to people, we should try to have that be exactly the same everywhere. And so right now we have one of these situations in which we're talking about these kind of conflicting value sets on a fairly broad scale of how do we manage our shorelands? Whose value sets take precedent when we think about the future of the lake ecosystems around here? Are they going to look one way? Are they going to look another way? And we don't really know the answer to that, but right now it's really more of a political question. It's really more about whose position, whose ideas are represented in the governance process right now. It's really not a question of science. It's really not a question of sort of these lake stewardship questions. It's a political question at this point. And so these really interesting political questions, I think, are things that we really need to try to understand as broadly as we can. It's one of the reasons I'm excited about working at Northland, about the process of education. I think it's just one of these ways in which we can really help people develop the tools, the perspective that they can to help wade through these really complicated questions that we have out there right now. I don't have any idea where this is going to end up here in the next few months, but there are decisions that could be made in the next month that could potentially dramatically alter what the lake ecosystems in our region look like, particularly the shoreline areas around here, and thinking about how we can go about making this process that is as representative of the collective individuals around the state is an important consideration. All right, that's kind of a downer. I'm going to leave you on an upward. One of the things that I find most heartening about the research that we have had is the willingness that people have to steward lakes into the future. So we ask them these questions: how willing would you be to? And then it follows up with these different questions. And so, modify the management of your property. This is for Lake Owen, to protect the quality of Lake Owen. We've done this same story in all the other lakes. Most everybody, blues are extremely willing, oranges are somewhat willing, somewhat unwilling, and extremely unwilling. Most everybody is willing to modify the management of their property to improve or protect the quality of Lake Owen. All right. Support efforts to protect the ecological health of Lake Owen if it limited the way you could manage your own personal property. A fairly big commitment, a fairly big statement for people. A substantial percentage of people, roughly 80% of the people, are somewhat willing or extremely willing to do things for the benefit of the lake, even if it potentially negatively affects them as an individual or negatively affects their ability to do what they want. Attend an educational event, okay? Maybe not surprising that a lot of people would be willing to do that. Volunteer. Fair number of people that are interested in doing that. Pay an increase in fees or taxes. Roughly 55% of the people are willing or extremely willing to pay more money to protect the overall health of the lake. Fairly big statement. The one that is most striking to me, and I just keep coming back to, but this question says, and you can't see all of it, financially support the ongoing protection and restoration of Lake Owen if you were to move away and never be able to use the lake again. So if you were to move to another part of the country, another part of the world, never come back, would you be willing to write a check for the continued protection and restoration of that lake? Roughly 40% of the people say that they would be willing or somewhat willing or extremely willing to do that. That totally took me by surprise with that. In fact, I didn't start to believe these things. I was like, well, you know, that's just one of those things where you ask somebody, would you write a check? And then they don't really have to write a check. So it's, you know, is that really a fair question to do something like that? I have gotten now 8 different calls from people at various lakes, not just on Lake Owen, where they have said, you know, I don't know if I'm actually qualified to fill the survey out. I used to live on the lake. I moved away. I don't ever come back anymore. I'm still on the Lake Association's distribution list because I just write them a check every year to keep their efforts going, to protect the lake into the future. They are never going to come back, but every year they write a check to these various lake associations to protect these lakes because they are so interested in the long-term stewardship and protection of them. I mean, it's a level of commitment that I would have never guessed existed around the protection of these different resources. And it's been true on every lake that we've worked. So I look at these different questions and these different problems about, okay, we have what's going to happen with the zoning laws and what's going to happen with the legal structure around these lakes. I'm incredibly heartened by just the general interest and willingness that people have to participate in lake restoration and management. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And I was mentioning that I was speaking to a lake association the other day, and they went around the room and they were saying, well, how long have people been affiliated with this particular lake association? And they went around the room and, you know, they got to me and I said, well, I've been studying the lake for, you know, a whopping 3 years, and everybody before me, there were 2 people, 88 years, 90 years, that they had been either living on or coming to the lake. You know, if I was going to give you an average, it was something like, you know, 45, 50, somewhere in there. But it was just an amazing amount of time in these people's lives that they had been connected to this resource. And you start to think about that, and the amount of time and the size of different people's lives that these resources have been, and maybe it's not so hard to think about, you know, well, you move away and you just really want to see that sustained into the future. Maybe that becomes something for someone that it was for you. And so, anyway, with that, I think it's a very positive note. I'll stop. I'll attempt to answer any questions that you might have with that, but thank you for taking the time to come out and listen to my presentation. Any questions? Oh. Yeah.
What do you think of Conservancy easements in the scope of your?
You mean like a permanently protected buffer, yes, or something like that?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. That's a pretty broad question. Let's see. I think they can have a lot of utility from a sort of a shoreline management perspective. I think the willingness to participate in those is highly variable based on the permanency of things like that. So one of the larger barriers that we've seen to participation in shoreline restoration programs is concerns about that. Am I going to make a decision now that I'm not going to fully appreciate the consequences of in 10 years and be in a spot that I'm not going to be able to roll back my decision at all? And that uncertainty about what people are committing to is a barrier to participation. And so in that sense, I see it as somewhat of a negative, but as we have seen in these areas where we have large tracts of high quality shoreline, those are typically the areas where we have the highest biological communities within the lake system. So a bit of both, I guess I would say. Yeah.
People around the lake vary in the density to which they occupy the land on the lake. How much difference does that density make to the quality of the lake?
It, again, is one of these questions of scale. So if every parcel around a lake is highly developed, that's generally not a good thing for the lakes. If one parcel around a lake is highly developed, that probably is inconsequential. So as the percentage of high density goes up, what ends up happening is it becomes more important within each of those parcels to really focus on these best management practices we talk about, things that can treat runoff, things that can help to protect shoreline areas. And so if there are one or two parcels in an otherwise undeveloped shoreline of a lake, it really doesn't matter what the density looks like. But as the numbers of highly developed parcels go up, it really becomes important to focus on doing everything that can happen on a parcel by parcel basis to minimize runoff, to maximize the amount of habitat that's there. So not a straightforward answer, but I think it's one of those questions of scale.
Is that being done?
Which element?
Is there an attention to the density around the lake on the part of the state or other people?
That is the part that is probably going away most if this NR 115 changes. So many of the counties have, so there's a minimum, like there are different lot dimensions that talk about density. In the places where counties have adopted additional shoreline zoning requirements, they have typically created either a range of different shoreline lot sizes depending on the lake class type, or they have increased lot size for reasons like that to try to create more areas of contiguous habitat. Yeah.
Kind of a follow-up on that question, is there, to maintain reasonable levels of health of a lake, is there a kind of an optimal ratio of wild lands versus developed areas around the lake?
It gets back to that question of if you have a developed land, how is that land developed? And so lake watersheds can handle more levels of development if those levels of development happen in a way that maximize those secondary benefits. I was talking about those positive externalities. If development is structured in such a way where the accidental byproduct or maybe the intentional byproduct is reductions in runoff, increases in habitat, increases in nearshore vegetation, then you can have higher levels of development. If you don't have that very proactive or positive externality that's happening, then the levels of development are much more difficult. And so, where on that continuum do you cross the threshold? It varies depending on the lake that you're on. We have different lake classes. So lakes that have really large land areas draining to them are a little bit less susceptible to those land use changes. If you have a lake with a really small area that drains to it, those are much more highly susceptible to changes because every change is a much higher percentage of the overall land area, as opposed to an area where there's a big chunk of land that drains to a lake. Every change is a much smaller percentage of the overall land area. So again, these questions of scale. Did that answer your question? Yeah.
You use that word runoff a lot, and I'm not quite sure what runs off.
Yeah,
that's
that's a great
the
question.
worst thing.
Yeah. So that list is probably long and somewhat distinguished. The one that we care the most about typically is phosphorus. So in freshwater lakes, generally speaking, phosphorus is what we call a limiting nutrient, meaning if you add that, that's the thing that will cause aquatic plants, algae to grow fastest. And that is the element of the ecosystem that can spiral fastest. So nutrient runoff to lakes is predominantly the concern that we have in our areas. There are other things like pesticides and herbicides and things of that nature. Generally speaking, those are a smaller question. The one that we focus most of our attention on is minimizing nutrient runoff to lakes. And in areas up here where our lakes are relatively low nutrient, they are low nutrient in nature. They are hypersensitive to phosphorus runoff. A little bit of phosphorus creates a potentially large change. If you go to a lake that already has lots of nutrients in, if you add a little bit more, the changes you see are relatively small. So when I'm saying runoff, generally speaking, I'm talking about nutrients, phosphorus, those types of things.
So a shoreline golf course would not be the best thing.
Depending on how the golf course is managed. But yeah, if they used much in the way of nutrient application and it wasn't being treated along the way, that has the potential to increase nutrient runoff, certainly. Yeah.
We were really talking about fertilizer application or pesticides application for the individual landowner, right? How they manage grass versus wild area along the lake, and what they do with cleared areas. Do they want a lush flat grass there?
Yeah, I would say mostly that's it's a land use component of things. The other element of that is this runoff question. So you have the amount of water, the quantity of water that runs off, and then you have the quality of the water that runs off. As you remove vegetation off the landscape, regardless, you almost always have an increase in the quantity of water. It's very difficult to do that unless you create some structure that is going to reduce the volume of water that runs off to a lake. You'd have to build, people have seen these rain gardens or a little collection basin where water runs off of a rooftop and goes through a gutter and ends up in a little pond for a little bit, and then it evaporates or it sinks into the ground. So there's the amount of runoff, and that's really hard to compensate unless you do something like a big engineered structure like that. The quality of the runoff, how much phosphorus is in there, is very dependent on if you're doing different types of fertilizer applications or different types of plants that might be there. Yeah?
How dangerous, or how much pollutant is added to a lake by modern outboard motors, or the kind of motors most of us have on pontoons or small watercraft?
That is one of the most positive developments that has happened in the last 10 or 15 years. It used to be that older two-cycle engines, you mix the oil right in, and that oil, a substantial percentage of it, was either burned off and got into the air or burned off and went out into the water behind you. The two-cycle engines that are sort of at the cutting edge right now have these new technologies to capture the oil and recycle it. So you don't even have to, you put oil in like once a year, and it very rarely, very small percentage of it gets into the water. And then you have four-stroke engines where the oil is mostly self-contained. So there are still certainly things that come out of boats, but the technologies we've developed over the last 10 or 15 years have really dramatically reduced the amount of oil getting into the water and getting into the air around there. It used to be actually fairly sizable, and now it's getting quite a bit better, actually. So that's very positive.
Is it the same for winter vehicles on the ice?
Ooh, I don't know the answer to that question. Yeah.
Can you talk just a little bit about the plans for the Center for Freshwater Innovation out at Forest Lodge?
Yeah. So,
What was the question?
Oh yeah, so the Center for Freshwater Innovation. So I'm serving in the role of co-director of this, and this is this initiative at Northland College that is starting and in partnership with the Forest Service, but going to be using the Forest Lodge site on Lake Nemacolin, the Mary Grigsburg family estate. And so the work that we're going to be doing is focused around science and communication. My background is in science. The other co-director, his name is Peter Annan. Some of you may know him. He wrote a book about the Great Lakes Water Wars, and his background is in environmental communication. And the work is really trying to marry those different ideas together of how do we bring science into the public conversation in more meaningful ways? How do we do science that helps to answer some of these questions that might really help us improve the management and health of water resource as a whole, not just lakes? And so we'll be actively continuing to do the lake research that we're doing, continuing to work with the different lake associations in the area to try to understand, what is it that's unique about Lake Owen or Lake Nemacolin or any of these other lakes that are around there. And then expanding that out to really try to take what we learn here so that it can have value in other lakes around the area and other parts of the country, perhaps. And then also the facility itself is going to become the site for a lot of meetings. to talk about these types of things. So getting people together that are doing research and pulling them together. Getting people together that are setting shoreline zoning laws and having them talk about, what's happening and what are the things we should be considering when we're passing new laws to govern the shoreland areas around lakes. And so we'll have a variety of different activities. I think the exciting part is most all the details of this are still to be fleshed out, and one of the hopes I think we have is that the way we do our work will be implemented through all the different partners. And so the more partners we have, the more different ways our work can go. So I think that's an open invitation for folks who have suggestions or thoughts on possibilities. Yeah.
Will you have position statements on issues such as NR 115?
We haven't talked about whether or not we'll have position statements on them. I mean, I've been fielding all sorts of questions with the media these days about it, but we don't have a paper.
Be a good idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
The one slide where it was stated that people didn't particularly like frogs and what was that?
I was surprised by that. Yeah.
So
Water-based mammals, specifically frogs and turtles, are bothersome.
okay,
A
so
fairly high percentage of people agree with that statement that characterizes their attitude.
so I find that kind of concerning, and that I hope that the work that you're doing, the work that the museum does, and the lake associations, with the education, to show people, to teach people how important all these little nuisance creatures are in the health of our environment and the water, the lake, and because it's so. But I just know as a kid, looking for frogs and how fun that was, and I can't imagine that that's not a really neat thing for for kids to experience.
Yeah, I was a bit surprised by that. So I mean, and this actually we have a smaller. We've only done this on asked this question on a couple different lakes. So I'm curious if that continues to portray itself out like that as we look at other lakes when we talk about this.
I would be interested in why.
Yes.
What is it about the frogs? Is it their noise at night and in the morning?
Yep. No, exactly. I mean, and that's you're on your way to this. I'm going the wrong way here. You're on your way to this slide. The having your cake and eating it too. I mean, that's really what we want to understand is the why of all of these things. And a lot of times the why is actually not in conflict with the the overall management objectives that we might have. And if the why is something that is really inconsequential, there are all sorts of things that can be done to preserve the habitat, preserve the water quality, and then address the why at the same time. So these are the kind of the phase 1 surveys that we're doing. The intent is to really delve into over time the drivers of behavior. Why is it that we do the different things, and what can we do to kind of live in both worlds, have our cake and eat it too? Yeah.
I vaguely remember, and I haven't kept up with it now that we no longer live in the Midwest all year round, that there was a real big movement in Wisconsin to ban the use of phosphorus.
Yes.
Didn't that take place, and did it just get rescinded?
I don't think it got rescinded. Somebody could correct me if they know that it had. So in 2009, I believe it was, Wisconsin passed a version of a phosphorus ban in fertilizer.
Yes.
So you weren't able, or you weren't supposed to use phosphorus on agricultural lands without a. You could use it in agricultural lands. You needed to have a soil test if you wanted to use it in urban lands. But one of the things that was an odd complicator with that is you could still sell it. And so there was a bit of a disconnect at one point in time that it was still available for purchase, but you weren't supposed to purchase it. And so there was a lot of effort to try to reconcile that, and I haven't heard actually where that landed. But there was a piece of legislation that was passed to minimize phosphorus usage and then phosphorus runoff. And to Wisconsin's credit, Wisconsin has probably one of the more progressive phosphorus management rules across the state. It's called the phosphorus rule. But quite a lot has been done to try to minimize phosphorus runoff into various water bodies. That was just one piece that was kind of happening in parallel to this broader statewide initiative that's out there. Yeah?
Has your organization or anyone's done anything to actually inventory individual lakes as terms of their condition, clarity, phosphorus content, things like that, to provide direction to lake organizations or?
Yeah, so two answers to that question. So that's all of what our work with lake groups is about, is really trying to understand how they use the lake, what's important to them and others around the lake, and then what is the condition of the lake as it's related to that stuff. So that's the focus of our lake-related research. We have some other things that are not lake-related, but that's what we do. The DNR also has a series of lake association-driven monitoring programs. So different lake associations often have a water quality monitoring representative. And they work through this grant program with the DNR, and they go out and they take water quality measurements and they send the samples off to the State Lab of Hygiene. And so the DNR is accumulating this database of water quality data and, you know, phosphorus concentrations and Secchi depths and all sorts of things like that. And they have been now for quite a while, 30, 40 years almost in some places. So depending on the lake, there are some of these data sets. Some of them are really long, like the Namakagon chain. Gosh, there must have been 15 years worth, at least 20 years worth of citizen water quality data that had been collected. There are other lakes where, you know, there's a sample here, a sample there. So it really depends on the lake that you're talking about. But there are at least those two initiatives.
All right, I think it's about 8 o'clock, so if you have more questions, you are welcome to come up and ask Randy. And, you know, talking about the frogs, I just want to remind you that next week's lecture is all about frogs. You can learn why they're not annoying. So let's thank Randy once again for